So the original idea behind the manuscript, I like to call it supply chain seatbelts. The reason being is we got this idea, the research team did, about risk compensation, and it was originally studied when seatbelt laws in the United States were being put in. And so what the researchers found initially, which turned out to be kind of controversial, so it made for a good idea, was that seatbelts are actually counterproductive. That's what some of the initial studies found, in that incident rates and accident rates actually increased when seatbelts were put on. And so the idea was that people had this desire to crave risk. And so when we started thinking about it, we said, okay, we're not really caring too much about seatbelts, but I wonder how procurement, sourcing, supply chain, and logistics professionals would really think about this, and whether or not when communication about risk or safety or things along those lines in the supply chain, how they would respond when the top management team, let's say, said the supply chain's been really safe and there have been very few incidents occurring. Would procurement personnel, would they crave more risk? And of course, the way to measure that would be, would they change their sourcing strategy? Would they change their percentage of suppliers geographically close and safety stock? And so, part of it was, it's not that interesting to think about people craving safety when they feel the risk is high. But on the opposite end, when they don't have enough risk, would they crave more? And so what it ended up being, the entire premise was about the disconnect between organizational communication from, let's say, the C-suite about supply chain safety and risk and things like that, and the disconnect between how frontline employees actually implemented it. So it was that kind of theoretical tension, or that disconnect, that we were really interested in studying.
Yeah, so the paper is all about looking at the interface between the way individuals behave and the way organizations communicate. And what we've seen is a lot of the research so far has looked at organizational behavior or individual behavior, but we don't ever see very much that juxtaposes the two and combines them in what I think is an interesting way in the paper. So what we basically are looking at is, how does an organization and the way they talk about risk and the way that they communicate risk to their employees, how does that change the actual behavior of the individual decision makers? So the other really interesting piece about this, I think, is how the research often focuses on executive level. How do executives make decisions? What type of decisions are they pushing? But in the supply chain perspective, a lot of the individual decisions come down to a number of managers spread all across the company. And they're these individuals who are making decisions with regards to, how much inventory should I hold in terms of safety stock? Should I have 2 suppliers for this, or should I only have 1 supplier for this? And so looking at these micro level decisions at these individual levels, but impacted by the way the CEOs and the executives communicate to the team and the way the organization communicates their levels of risk, creates a really interesting area for research, because as the organizations change their way they communicate, they can impact the decisions at this individual level from all the individual employees who are making those decisions.
Sure. So the idea here is that, we respond to signals. And, one of the things that the paper is essentially saying is that organizations, senior leadership, they communicate messages. They communicate messages about risk. And that can have a profound influence on how individuals act, be that good or bad. Obviously the notion here is that if the organization is communicating that we're doing better with risk levels are lower than they have been, what that essentially says is that can embolden a sort of supply manager to act in ways which offset that lower risk. Again, to the extent that supply chain managers are getting evaluated based on metrics that are more germane to them, what incentivizes them is to act in their best interests or in the best interests of their unit. And the implication, therefore, is that if the organization is communicating that there's lower risk, again, that might give the supply chain manager confidence to say, I can afford, therefore, to compensate for that by taking more risk, should that have a positive impact on their or their unit's actual performance, which is what they're going to get rewarded and compensated based on. So I think that's a very, very powerful message that I think in this area we often talk about words matter. Well, words matter here. I mean, for good or for bad, if an organization communicates that there's been a reduction in risk, it may create potentially counterproductive behavior. But consequently, if an organization were to say that risk levels are going up, that could conceivably incentivize behaviors that reduce at the local level decision makers' behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. So the methodology, we leveraged a behavioral experimentation approach. We used a platform called Prolific in order to crowdsource supply chain professionals. And we had them do a multi-stage study where we gauged different risk preferences. Initially, we gauged kind of their baseline level of risk and how much risk they would take. And then the really novel part of the study was we didn't necessarily just gauge or measure the level of risks they were taking, but the change in between. So from an experimentation standpoint, we kind of manipulated the communication about risk, whether it be an opinion from the C-suite or whether that be historical factual data about risk management strategies. And what we were testing was how people would change their risk. So to go back to the premise, if that supply chain seatbelt was implemented, would decision makers increase or decrease? And the mechanism by which they did that was really the experimentation approach. And then once we gathered the data via this behavioral experiment, we leveraged a series of regressions in order to test whether or not these effects were present.
We found some really interesting things. Things that we partially expected, and some things that were stronger than we expected. So, for example, we expected that when people communicate a higher level of risk, people are going to play a little bit safer, right? Take a little bit more secure decisions in terms of their risk. So if you're in a very risky situation, maybe you'll have more inventory, or maybe you'll have more reliable sourcing locations that you're sourcing from. And we expected that. But the thing that was really interesting was that when we compared the way that individuals looked at the communication from management, the biggest impact came from the tone of the communication from the management. So how did they convey that, are we in a successful risk environment, a negative risk environment, as opposed to an effect that basically didn't show up was the actual levels of risk. So when we talked about the percentage of disruptions facing the company in the last 2 years, that had almost no impact on the actual behavior. And so what happens was that when we feel that there's a high level of risk, when there's an emotional communication about the level of risk, that's what's taken forward, and that's what changes the individual's behavior to lead to different risky situations or to less risky situations.
Yeah, I think this is one of the more salient papers that I've worked on to be able to really communicate to practitioners, simply because you don't want to kind of shoot yourself in the foot with respect to how you're communicating about your supply chain. And so that's the first thing in terms of thinking really about how communication about risk management and safety along the supply chain is being implemented. But the second thing to really think about is that oftentimes practitioners who are designing supply chain strategy at the corporate level, there's a disconnect between thinking about who's actually implementing it. And those frontline employees are responsible for the delivery or the administration of the strategy from the top line. So how it can impact practitioners, I think, is managing that disconnect to ensure that their efforts in order to disseminate strategy are being received properly by frontline personnel who are actually and ultimately going to implement those strategies.
So I think there are a lot of different places where this could go. This really is an introductory piece looking at the connection between organizational communication and risk. There are a number of places in particular I would say that there's some possibilities. The first one is tying this back to the whole concept of organizational culture. Some organizations are by their very nature of leadership, more risky than others. How does that translate in terms of how does the organization communicate risk? How does that in turn influence individual level behavior? So I think there's a whole piece of organizational communication. There are quite possibly differences based on industry. Some industries are by their very nature a little bit more stable, a little bit more steady, not nearly as volatile, not nearly as subject to market-based risks. How does what we're finding here have an impact across different industries, and what are the implications? I think from a culture standpoint, as we think about national culture, this study was carried out in the United States. Well, if you take a look at the U.S. versus Asian cultures, European cultures, where again attitudes towards risk are different, I think we might find some more nuanced understanding of do these results transfer across national boundaries? If so, what are the dynamics of that? I think that's an important sort of next step to go with this. I think another important part of this also is looking at this from the perspective of ethics. If it is the case that if an organization says that when risk goes down, it emboldens decision makers to go ahead and increase their risk. Okay, what are the implications of that? And maybe that's better stated in reverse. If an organization wants to reduce its risk, maybe the thing to do is to tell its employees, its managers, risk levels have gone up because, as we're seeing, there is a compensatory behavior. That potentially has implications for ethics, for how do we make ethical decisions. It also has implications for other parts of the organization. I think if we think about, for example, if an organization would communicate that risk is going up as a way of incentivizing decreases in individual risk, that same message is going to be seen by other places in the marketplace. For example, financial analysts, they will see that message. What are the implications there? So I think we can't just look at this from the perspective of communication and supply chain managers. We need to more broadly understand what are the broader dynamics of some of these behaviors.